So the two composers you've already done this to were Babbitt and Diamond? No.
Diamond and Gould.
And Gould, that's it.
Yeah.
Diamond and Gould.
I'm so glad we got the interview with Morton.
Yeah, that's really good.
For the record, I'm Ellen Taaffe Zwilich. I hold the first composer's chair at Carnegie Hall. Today is April 30th, 1996. We're here in the Carnegie Hall archives with composer, conductor, pianist Lukas Foss. Lukas, I introduced you as composer, conductor, pianist. Seems to me that's the right order. Do you feel that's the right order?
I feel very comfortable with that order.
And it seems to me you remind me a little bit of myself in the sense of life sort of coming more and more into focus as you go along. And it seems to me it's becoming more and more the composing as your major statement, it seems to me.
Well, it was always a little bit that way. I don't know if it's changed much. That's hard to say. I still spend a lot of time conducting and some time playing the piano, so it's pretty much more of the same.
So it's very much then a part of your whole structure and your makeup that you do all of these things.
Mm-hmm. I was born in Berlin, and age 11 I came to Paris, and age 15 to these United States, namely New York. So I've been in America ever since.
Lukas, was there some precipitating event that caused your family to leave?
Of course, the Nazis. Yes, it was clear to my father that things were getting worse way back already in 1933. He said, we've got to go immediately. And then in 1937 he decided we were still too close to problems and trouble in Paris, and that's when we came over here.
Yeah. When you were in Berlin, you must have been 10 or 11 when you left.
Yeah.
What was your awareness of the political situation?
I think I was aware of it, but being a child and being very optimistic, I was never afraid for my life or anything like that, which was very naive, of course, but I thought everything was going all right.
I was just wondering, you were already studying music, of course, as a child in Germany. Mm-hmm. Did you have important teachers at that?
I started at age 7 with Julius Goldstein Herford. He left when he came to America at the suggestion of my mother. He left out the name Goldstein, just took his second name, the married name, Herford. And he came here, I forgot what year it was, but I think it must have been roughly 1944, something like that. And I remember Robert Shaw saying to me, with whom did you study? You're so young and you're such a good musician. I said, yes, I had a very good teacher. Do you want to study with him? He's just arrived in New York. And he did.
Isn't it amazing how interrelated we all are? It's really quite extraordinary, that this fabric of musical life that weaves all these strands together. When you went to Paris, then, did you continue your schooling?
Absolutely. I studied piano with Lazare Lévy, composition, or rather harmony, with Noël Gallon. I studied solfège, flute with Louis Moïse, and one lesson with Marcel Moïse's father.
Oh, really?
Those were the Paris days. Conducting didn't start until I came to the Curtis Institute, age 15, and enrolled in Fritz Reiner's conducting class there.
Did you drop the other instruments?
I dropped the flute because I was only allowed to have 3 scholarships. So I studied at Curtis Composition, piano with Vengerova, and conducting with Reiner.
So your recent flute concerto is a return to your past in a more direct way than I had thought.
Maybe that's why I decided to make it a Renaissance concerto. I don't know what prompted that, but to me the flute is a kind of Renaissance instrument. There's nostalgia involved, I think.
And a rebirth of an old love? Or?
Maybe that must be it.
Well, you came in about 15 to this country, right?
Exactly.
And that's awfully young to go to Curtis. That must have been quite an audition, I imagine.
I'm sure I was not the only one 15 years old to study at Curtis. Curtis has some young people. It was, but me.
Did you go to study conducting, you said?
Yeah, right away with Fritz Reiner. Still remember auditioning for him. He pushed a score under my face, sort of saying, "Hey, what's that?" I said, "Slow movement, Beethoven Fourth." "Okay, I'll take you. Goodbye." And then as I was about to get out of the door, he said, "One more thing," as if he had said anything. "You probably think you're young to learn how to conduct. You're almost too old."
Oh, boy.
And by the way, having come from Paris, I was in knee pants.
Yes. Who were some of the other musicians? I mean, you mentioned you were studying with Vengerova. That's really quite another subject. But who were some of the other students at the time at Curtis? You know, I'm asking you questions that I
Who
probably
studied
know the
at that
answer to.
time at Curtis? Well, I know Gary Grafman also studied with Vengerova and also came to Curtis very young. I don't remember who other Curtis students were at that time.
Did you meet Bernstein there?
Yes, I met Bernstein, as a matter of fact, in Fritz Reiner's conducting class. And then we were both picked to go to Chicago and watch him conduct Rosenkavalier.
Ooh.
And on that trip, we really became good friends. And he was like an older brother to me ever since.
Yes, we have some lovely pictures that sort of chronicle that friendship that we'll get to in a moment. What was it like studying with Reiner?
He was kind to me because I was so young, I think, but he could be very hard on his students. I mean, I remember him watching a fellow student in class, an older student, and he seemed to hardly look at him, and then suddenly he looked up and said, "Give it up." That was a typical Fritz Reiner attitude. But to me, he was wonderful, and he also gave me my first breaks. I remember he did a concert with the Pittsburgh Symphony where he conducted my first symphony, and I played a Bach concerto and conducted Leonore 3. I mean, that was a real break.
Oh, boy, yes.
And then later I had, of course, Kursewitsky as a teacher who was equally wonderful to me and like a father.
And that was at Tanglewood.
That was Tanglewood,
That was
yes.
at Tanglewood.
By that time I was 17.
You were an old man of 17. When you were studying at Curtis, you studied also with Scalero.
Yes.
Was that a pleasant experience? We know him
well,
as Menotti and Barber's teacher.
To be honest, yes, that's why I studied with him, because Menotti and Barber told me, you must study with our teacher. But what they didn't realize, that their teacher, Scalero, by the time I got to Curtis, was really not quite all right. He was a little bit getting old, and so I don't think I learned anything from him.
But you learned a great deal from Reiner, I'm sure.
Yes.
And Vengerova.
And Vengerova, yes.
Let's skip to Tanglewood. At this point, this is where you met Hindemith and Stravinsky.
Well,
Is that
Hindemith I
correct?
met before, but in order to audition for him, I met him just before, but that's where I really got to know him.
Was he in
Tanglewood.
residence at Tanglewood?
Yes, he was the composer in residence at Tanglewood.
And this would have been, do you remember the year?
Yes, it was the first year of Tanglewood. The very first year. In other words, 1940.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was 17, as I said, and I remember Kursewitsky saying to me, well, you're so young, why don't you study just with Hindemith and with me next year? Because you can't really do both. So I said, oh, what a pity, because I've spent time studying scores and I've never had a chance to stand in front of an orchestra. Could I at least do the audition? So he said, yes, you can do the audition. So I did the audition till Eulenspiegel. And when that was over, he said to me, if you want, you will have, in his wonderful English. And that meant I could do both.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
And so you did.
Yeah.
And how was your experience with Hindemith?
He was very Germanic, but in a sense he was right to be, I mean, he said things like, I remember to one student he said, what are you afraid of writing in my style while you study with me? Later on you can do what you want. That was sort of his attitude. And once he wrote me a letter saying, a teacher is like a doctor. If you don't want to do what the doctor says, then go and find another doctor. That was his urging me to submit to what he had to.
How did you, I can't see you as too submissive.
Well, he threw me out of class once
No.
because I was such a rebel, a teenage rebel. And he wrote a note to Koussevitzky saying, Koussevitzky read me the note. It said, I cannot teach Lukas Foss. He wants to know, but he doesn't want to follow. And Koussevitzky thought,
like
that's
a wonderful
wonderful.
compliment.
That's exactly what I want my students to do, to want to know and not to follow. I'll make him take you back. And he did. So in those days, I was so lucky. I always got out of trouble. First into trouble and then out of trouble. But the reason why I was such a rebel actually was another reason. Namely, thanks to Hindemith, I discovered modern music. Because until that moment, I didn't like modern music. I liked only Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach, and Schubert, all the classics. I adored the classics. And I didn't like modern music. And then I discovered Hindemith. And I really got into new music. But just as I was ready to study with him, I discovered Stravinsky. That was bad timing, so therefore now suddenly Hindemith was no longer the god he was for me up to that moment.
Yeah. And you actually came in contact with Stravinsky at Tanglewood, didn't you? As I have a picture over there.
Was it Tanglewood where I first came into contact with Stravinsky?
I don't know.
It could very well have been Tanglewood. It could also have been the Boston Symphony, but that was a little late, I think. Yeah, when I was pianist of the Boston Symphony, that was when Stravinsky came to my studio. That was a little later.
Now, you went to Boston Symphony as pianist in, what, 1944?
I came to the Boston Symphony as pianist. That was probably around 1944, yes. I think that must have been about the time.
Here's a picture of you with Stravinsky at Tanglewood, which we're going to get a better shot of later. So when you say you discovered Stravinsky, can you go into a little more detail about that? I'm sure you mean the artist rather than the man.
I mean the composer, yes, the compositions.
And
yes.
What were the pieces that really
I think
set
Symphony
you
of
on
Psalms
fire?
was the first one. Psalm Symphony was the first one, I believe. And then came Story of a Soldier. I loved those works. I just loved them.
And they opened a new vista then, I guess, for you.
Exactly, yes.
Was it after this time then that you went to Yale, I guess, where Hindemith was?
Yes, after my first summer of Tanglewood came a winter at Yale. That was the time, that's all the studying I did with Hindemith, a summer and a winter.
No spring.
Maybe spring was part of it, I'm not sure. I'm not sure now.
And was that a happy experience?
Yes, I think it became better as we went along, and we became actually friends after I studied with him. But I remember in Tanglewood we had good times too, when we all went, the whole class, and we went swimming in the lake. I still remember Hindemith diving into the lake, stomach first. I remember the sound, the sound of Hindemith's stomach on the water.
Well, at any rate, your first performance here at Carnegie Hall came very early. And it's interesting what you said about Shaw, your having met Shaw when you first came over and having shared a teacher, because I see that Robert Shaw gave the premiere of your work called Prairie.
That's right, he did,
kind of
in Town Hall.
And that it was broadcast, and that Arthur Rogensky, who was then the conductor of the Philharmonic, heard the broadcast and programmed it for the next season.
I think that's what happened, absolutely. And by the way, that was the first time Robert Shaw conducted an orchestra.
Oh, really?
Because before that, he had always conducted concerts with the choir alone or the choir and piano. But I remember him telling me that that's the first time I'm conducting an orchestra.
And of course, he maintains to this day a very close relationship with Carnegie Hall. Let's just pull out a picture of, here's a contemporary picture of Robert Shaw. Okay, and here's some, well, that's a posed picture. I also have, I have a manuscript of the Prairie, just a little bit, so we could just have a little of that. I see these wide open sounds, very.
Those
very
are the opening
American
bars, I
sort of-
believe.
Yes, of Prairie.
Yeah, opening bars.
Very American. Your adopted country
Yes,
seduced you.
Exactly. I would say my love for America is due to the music of Aaron Copland and the poetry of Carl Sandburg. I'm now not as close to that poetry as I was at that time. But when I said the Prairie, I mean, that's based on Sandburg's poetry.
Yes.
And I met Sandburg too. And as a matter of fact, after the Prairie performance, Sandburg took me to a party where he introduced me as Demon Welterweight Composer.
Demon welterweight composer. Well,
Yes.
my goodness. That's
Yes.
a rather poetic introduction, right? We didn't get a picture of Rodzinski. This is really about that same time. It's a little bit earlier. To your knowledge, did Rodzinski carry a gun to the rehearsal of your work?
I remember
There's this-
baton, but that was not a gun.
This is
He
wonderful
didn't
story.
conduct with
that-
a gun. I would remember that.
There's a rumor that's been around for many years that he attended rehearsals with a gun in his pocket.
I wonder why.
I don't
That
know.
would be interesting. That would be interesting. But I heard nothing about that rumor.
Anyway, so you were talking about American influences, and here's a young boy who's
Yes. You
Very
see, I met
European.
Copland even before Tanglewood, and I'm trying to remember who introduced me to Copland. Was it Barbara Minatti? I have no idea. Maybe neither of them. But I met him in his apartment in the Empire building. And he played for me the Second Hurricane, his high school opera.
Oh, really?
And I was very excited. And I remember carrying a suitcase that contained dirty laundry, but I was too scared to admit that it was such an irrelevant and irreverent thing that I was carrying. I think I pretended there were scores in there or so, but it was actually laundry. Later on, 5 years later, as a grown-up, I had the courage to tell him about that.
So you were very much welcome then into the circle of American composers.
Well, you see, in those days, if you were talented, all the doors were opened. It is not like today. Today, if you're talented, so what? Another talent, who cares? Today, if you're successful, then the doors open. That's what they want, success. Fortunately, those days were different. You must have had a hard time because of that. I mean, you were so talented, but...
I think things are very different, yes. When I was coming of age, it was much...
You had to win a Pulitzer Prize to get the recognition you deserve.
Well, it didn't hurt. But it seems to me that there must have been a wonderful kind of circle of composers, as well as the conductors who were ready to hear a broadcast and really like the piece and run out and do it the next season. And that's a big piece. That's a long...
Prairie is huge, yes. That's almost 50 minutes of music.
So
it's an oratorio. And it's a work I still am very fond of. And it gets done from time to time.
So I gather there must have been a very nice circle of composers who had access to the major conductors. And it's also interesting that somebody like Fritz Reiner was teaching at Curtis. And,
Exactly.
rather than,
Yeah.
flying back and forth across the ocean. And,
That's right. No, it's wonderful. I mean, and then there was George Szell, who heard, I think, the Prairie, and decided to ask me to write him a short piece, sort of 10-minute, 12-minute piece, for a concert he was conducting as guest conductor of the New York Philharmonic in Carnegie Hall. And
this is the one for which we could not find a program.
that's right, but I know it happened.
40s archives are very sketchy.
Very sketchy. It was called Ode to Those Who Will Not Return.
Yeah.
It's,
And this was written just after the war?
after World War II, right.
And what was your experience with Szell like?
Stormy. I hate to admit that I was such a terribly arrogant bastard at that time, but I remember that Szell at the first rehearsal, no, the first rehearsal I was just appointed pianist of the Boston Symphony, so I couldn't attend that, which bothered Szell a lot. But I came to the second rehearsal, and at one point he turned around to me at the rehearsal and said, "You see, this doesn't sound." And I said, "Maybe that's the way you conduct it." And my God, he turned around, didn't say a word, went through the performance like the professional that he is, but didn't speak to me anymore. And that went on for years. And then, you know, about 15 years later, I looked at the score, and it's a nice piece, but it wasn't orchestrated right. So I thought he was right. I reorchestrated it, sent him the new orchestration, and never heard from him. Even though I sent it him and said, "You were right." Another 5 years went by, and I was conducting in Amsterdam. And I was doing a program of modern music, including, however, the Beethoven Große Fuge, which to me is modern music.
Absolutely.
And yeah, isn't it though? It's a crazy piece, wonderful piece. I loved it. And when I came back to my hotel, I found a note there. George Szell had called. It was a message for me. I couldn't believe my eyes and ears. I called him up immediately because that's what the message said, "Call me." In fact, the message said, "I like your passionate intellectual approach to the Große Fuge. Give me a ring." I called him up and he said, "You have your calendar here? You'll be conducting the Cleveland Orchestra this year, such and such a date, next year, such and such a date." I couldn't believe it.
Oh my.
We were friends again.
That's
But it took 20 years.
that's a wonderful story. I wish we had that program. We don't, but we do have this program of the Prairie. Why don't you look through this? I'm always struck when we see these programs from the 40s, the kinds of advertisements they have.
Todd Duncan, of course. Dorothy, Kristen, Todd Duncan. Arthur Judson was the manager, yes.
The Philharmonic
Of the
manager,
Philharmonic,
yeah.
of course.
And what was the orchestra like in those days, the musicians?
Wonderful. Well, I mean, look, I was in heaven. I mean,
Yeah.
and Wojcicki did a fine job, and the orchestra did a beautiful job, and really, I was lucky. I mean, that's was sort of my step from anonymity into being a name that people were familiar with.
Yeah. It's, I do have this photo of when Bernstein made his debut with the Philharmonic, and Leonard Rose, and this is Joe Polisi's father, and John Corigliano. I don't know who the other
Corigliano's
person.
father.
Yes, John Corigliano's father. But they had some really wonderful musicians. I mean, one thinks of Leonard Rose sitting there. You know, he was one of the great cellists, and
Yeah.
he was in the Philharmonic at that time. You also remember another concert for which we have no documentation, and that is shortly after this performance of The Prairie, you went to Boston Symphony as a pianist, right?
Right.
Under Kusevitsky. And then he brought you here sometime in the late 40s.
That's right.
To do the Mendelssohn Concerto.
Right.
And I wish we could find that program, but we haven't found it, and if we do,
But
we'll...
there's a pirated record around from that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Is it out on a...
I think it was out because somebody sent it to me, and it looked like something had been sold.
Yeah. Well, anything's
Packaged.
possible, especially from those days, I think.
Yeah.
How did it sound
Sounded okay.
when you listened back all those years later?
Oh, it sounded nice.
Did you find that daunting, playing a concerto with the Boston Symphony and
Oh,
Carnegie
of course.
Hall?
Of course. And it was a nice thing to do. So I was very happy doing it.
Yeah. You appeared a little bit later where we have a program with, you actually did the premiere of Bernstein's Age of Anxiety.
That's right.
And we have...
The concert premiere, not the ballet premiere. You know, it was written as a kind of ballet for Jerry Robbins. And I don't know who did the ballet premiere, but I did the concert one.
This is the... This is the actual program from the orchestral. Here, you can sit down. I'll just put this on your lap. The orchestral premiere of the...
Of the Age of Anxiety.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
It's funny. Every time we look at one of these old programs, there's a corset ad. Makes me glad to be living in the 90s.
Very exciting.
That must have been fun. That's
you know
a,
that
that's
I
a fun
recorded
piece.
that work twice?
Really?
Once with the New York Philharmonic and once with the Israel Philharmonic. That recording took place in Berlin.
Mm.
Yeah. So also there are two versions. The later recording has the complete score. The earlier one there was still the cadenza and the last movement missing.
Oh my.
That Bernstein added later.
Yeah. He did Copland's Outdoor Overture.
I think I always prefer the first recording, if I remember correctly.
Oh, and he did Harold Shapiro.
Yeah, the little adagio.
From the Symphony for Classical Orchestra, which has enjoyed something of a renaissance now.
Nice.
Then Beethoven, Eighth Symphony.
And I'm still a Baldwin artist. Nothing has changed.
Le plus ça change. How do you think programs have changed in this country over your
Well,
lifetime?
depending on who the conductor is. Obviously, Boulez's programming was different from Bernstein's. And Rudzinski's was different from Mitropoulos.
Mitropoulos' programs certainly seemed awfully interesting. You know,
yes.
he did long kind of...
He was a very open-minded musician, and he also was a friend of mine and did my music with the New York Philharmonic. He did a piece called Psalms. I remember that performance. I think that was the first performance of that work.
He also did your Song of Songs in 1956.
Mitropoulos did.
Mitropoulos.
That's interesting because I remember Koussevitzky doing it, and I don't... That's sort of
Well, I think we have the evidence here.
I believe you.
Let me see where...
Song of Songs was also done by Bernstein, but I forgot whether it was Carnegie
Yes,
Hall
here's a Song of Songs with Mitropoulos conducting.
Delighted.
He also did Skalkotis.
Skalkotis.
Yes, Greek dances. Vaughan Williams Symphony No. 4.
Unusual program.
Saint-Saëns symphonic poem.
I had wonderful talks with Mitropoulos. I was very fond of him. I thought he was a wonderful intellectual, wonderful person.
Yes, he must have been. I've read the new book, and
Yes.
both David Diamond and Morton Gould had extensive relationship with him, and
Yeah, I cannot
people
say that
really loved him.
Yeah, I didn't have an extensive relationship, but we had some wonderful talks and some wonderful lunches. Under his picture in the Russian tea room.
Yes. What an appropriate spot. Okay, this is in January of 1956. This is Mitropoulos and your Song of Songs. Then the Psalms he did in 57. Whoops, I'm making a mess here. Here again, it's a very interesting program.
Let's see, what was it? My goodness. Nobody does that kind of program anymore. That's very interesting.
The author of the book on Mitropoulos seemed to feel that his programming kind of got him into hot
Into
water.
trouble. Well,
But as we look back on it, it looks so interesting, you know, it's adventurous and
sometimes my
exciting.
programming got me into trouble in Buffalo or in. Yeah.
Do you think the audience is more or less conservative than it was? How were you received in the 40s as this young composer?
You know, it really depends
With
where.
pieces.
I don't think New York audiences were not that conservative. But in other cities, they tended to be a little more conservative.
Apropos George Szell, this is the letter from George Szell.
Oh, you just found it in
Yes.
my
And
letter?
your mementos here.
Does it have
The
something
Amstel
to do?
Hotel in Amsterdam.
Oh, that was oh my goodness.
Yes.
That's a letter that's wonderful.
I like stories that have a happy ending, even if it takes 20 years. So, I mean, that's a...
That's very nice.
Lucas, here's a chronicle here. I wanted to show these side by side. Pictures of you and Bernstein at Tanglewood. Now, we don't know exactly what date this was.
It could have been 42, 41, I don't know. It was very early, obviously. No, it couldn't have been that early. That's impossible, because we weren't yet married.
Yeah.
I wasn't yet married, and I don't think Lenny was married at that time.
So it must have been around the time that you premiered
Yes,
the
because our
Age of
wives are
Anxiety?
turning the pages.
Okay.
There's Felicia Bernstein turning for Lenny and Cornelia Foss turning for Lukas.
So we can nail down that time as being very close to...
So I must have been already 28 years old, or 29, maybe even 30. So it was probably around 1950.
Yeah, this was around the time that you premiered The Age of Anxiety with Bernstein.
Yeah.
That's a charming picture. I like
Yeah.
that. And this is a very nice picture of you and Bernstein, which I figure must be from the 60s. This looks like Carnegie Hall in the background, but
Maybe.
there's no notation on the picture as to where it is. And this was a rather intense period of collaboration with Bernstein. We have, I believe this would be around the time when Bernstein in 58 and 60, he did Song of Songs in 58, and Introductions and Goodbyes in 60, and Time Cycle in 1960. So this might very well have been that time. And then, of course, here's a wonderful later picture of you and Bernstein that we don't know where it's from. It looks like it might be a broadcast because of the microphones.
Did he do Time Cycle in Carnegie Hall?
He did Time Cycle in Carnegie Hall in 1960.
Oh, is that when he did it twice? In other words, because at the premiere, he turned around to the audience and said, "My colleagues and I think highly of this work, and even if there are only 12 people who want to stay in the audience, we're going to play it again for those 12 people." And he did the whole thing over again.
Oh, I love it.
That was unusual. I don't think a 22-minute piece has ever been done twice in Carnegie Hall before.
Let's see what the program looked like. Program continued. He started with the Siegfried Idyll, the Schumann Cello Concerto with Leonard Rose playing, intermission. Pardon me, but I always notice when I see these programs that the publishers are advertising scores for sale. which is so different from today's world.
So it's very different, yeah.
I see Carl Fisher was advertising the latest editions in our study score series, Lukas Foss, William Bergsma, and
Wonderful.
they were selling Ode and Song of Songs.
Great. And that's the program with Time Cycle?
Yes, this is on the program.
Oh, good. So that's the one.
Then after intermission,
Time Cycle.
he
That's
did the
it?
time cycle.
And that's when you repeated it. Yeah.
That's a marvelous story.
Now, when we did Time Cycle there, we did it with an improvisation ensemble.
Yes,
And that was an unusual story because I had never intended Time Cycle to have these improvisations in between the songs. What happened was that I saw Lenny shortly before this performance in Los Angeles, where I was then professor of music at UCLA. And Lenny said to me, "Lucas, you gave your improvisation concerto to Ormandy. How could you do that? Why didn't you give it to me?" I said, "But you're doing Time Cycle. I gave Time Cycle to you." "Yes, but that doesn't have improvisations." So I said, "Well, we could always be like the clowns in Commedia dell'arte. Between the songs, my group could come and play improvisations." And I laughed, and he laughed. It was fun. And then for years, I couldn't get rid of the improvisations, even with the Berlin Philharmonic when they engaged me to conduct. Said, "We've got to have Time Cycle with your improvisation group." And they flew everybody to Berlin to do it just that way. Now, however, there is no longer an improvisation group, and Time Cycle is done the way I'd intended. And when Bernstein did the premiere with the improvisation group, as he repeated it without the improvisations. Otherwise, it would have been 40 minutes all over again.
I see what Bernstein was talking about, because in this, just not too far back in our program book, I have a concert with Ormandy conducting the Philadelphia Orchestra, where he does the J.C. Bach Sinfonia, a very interesting idea. I didn't know people were doing J.C. Bach in 1960. Sibelius' Fifth Symphony, your concerto for improvising solo instruments and orchestra.
That's right.
Followed by the Respighi Festa Romana.
So that was also in Carnegie Hall.
Yes.
My God, everything in those days was in Carnegie Hall.
Well, sure. All the years that the New York Philharmonic was in residence, all of the important premieres, I think.
That's right.
Or many of them certainly took place here.
Well, I'm glad you found that.
Now, Mitropoulos also did your Psalms in 57. This is about the way he looked at that time, isn't it?
Yes, like a monk.
Yes.
My God, yes, that was him, all right.
It's really a wonderful, wonderful man. Now, the next thing we have is the New York Philharmonic in 1961 under Cripps doing A Parable of Death.
Oh, yeah.
How would you compare Cripps to the other conductors you worked with?
Well, Cripps was very good in a certain repertory, but he was not the most adventurous conductor when it came to modern music. However, I succeeded him in Buffalo, and that's, I guess, how he got to know me and my music. He got interested in who his successor was, I guess. And maybe that's why I did Parable of Death. I don't remember.
So at this time you went to Buffalo. How long
Yes.
did you stay in Boston? You were in Boston from
In
44?
Boston, 4 years. I was pianist with the Boston Symphony for 4 years.
And then you moved back to New York? Or
Yes.
when you were going to Curtis, did you commute from New York or did you live in Philadelphia?
I commuted from New York. Yes.
A lot of people still do, I guess.
Yeah. That's what I did.
So you've probably spent most of your professional life in and around New York then.
Yes.
You were saying Cripps found out about you that way, and this is from December 61.
Yeah.
So you
And
must have-
Parable of Death is a cantata for narrator, tenor solo, and chorus and orchestra. And it's at the height of my neoclassic period. It's very Bachian. It's well, my love for Bach is all over the place in that work.
I see that Felicia narrated it.
Felicia Bernstein, yes. Did she narrate under Felicia Bernstein or Felicia Montenegro?
Montenegro.
Yeah.
And Rudolf Petrarch was the tenor, Westminster Symphonic Choir. And Cripps did the Beethoven 9 on that same program
Oh, really?
with a young Shirley Verrett, mezzo-soprano.
My goodness.
There again, I see the publishers advertising an indication of a different.
Well, publishers
different
had more
age.
money then, because Xerox hadn't yet killed their business.
Do you think Xerox has killed their business? Or?
Well, sure, everybody just photostat scores instead of buying them.
Yeah, it might be other factors too. I think when I'm speaking with the composers who are in their 80s today and older, the way they got to know music essentially was through printed music, four hands, even Beethoven symphonies. But when you came along, I mean, even at a very young age, things were already, there were lots of orchestral performances and recordings, weren't there? So I think that has made a big change.
I'm sure that's part of it, yes.
I remember Roger Sessions talking about how he first had contact with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, that the word had come over how exciting this piece was, and that he drove the horse and buggy into town and bought a four-hand version, and that's how he discovered it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We have a lovely letter in Roger's hand.
Yes, I was not a close friend of Roger Sessions, but I got to know him and even was at his house out of town. Wasn't in New York City, it was somewhere else, I forgot where.
At Princeton.
Yes, he was a wonderful man, but I never studied with him, so I didn't get to know him as well as some other people did who studied with him.
I loved him. I studied with him, and he was
you did,
wonderful,
that's right.
wonderful person to work with.
Did he also say that to you, namely, if I knew what the music of the future would be, I would write it? I remember that statement.
That sounds like Roger.
I remember that statement.
I found him a very inspiring teacher. I really liked him.
And a very nice, unassuming man.
Yeah, and he didn't intrude upon what it was that I was doing. And of course, I studied with him rather late in his life, so I think he might have been very mellow. And still, when you look at the number of students that he taught and the different styles that came out,
Kirchner among them, many wonderful students.
Oh, it's just
they all loved him.
Enormous list of people, all of whom were quite different. And yes, I think we all loved Roger. This is probably from around the same era, but here's a wonderful telegram from Stravinsky and a postcard. I think this is from early 60s.
Well, Stravinsky was a close friend, yes.
What was he like?
He's wonderful, wonderful. He once came to my studio in Boston when he was guest conducting there. I thought he conducted very interestingly. I learned a lot from him, but the Boston Symphony thought that he was amateur conductor. I remember him saying, staccato, oh! And I thought the oh was very revealing. He didn't want a dry little staccato. He wanted a much more volcanic one.
Yeah.
And I thought it was great. And I learned a lot, but everybody imitated him and poked fun at him because he wasn't the typical conductor who came with a recipe to the orchestra rehearsal, and because he conducted without any showmanship at all. He just beat time and listened. He was all ears. But anyway, he decided to come to my studio to hear me play some piece of mine for him. And I was very amazed that he would do that and very happy. And I invited my friends Irving Fine and Harold Shapiro to join because they loved him even more than I did. I mean, he was their god. So I shared that experience with Stravinsky, with my friends. And he was very interesting. He would say things like, "Why did you give this to the trumpet?" "Well, sounds like a trumpet tune, doesn't it?" "Sounds like a trumpet tune? Give it to the violins." Things like that, that one remembers forever. But I was a little disappointed that he didn't actually say your music is special or something like that. He just looked at it very, very professionally, but he didn't make any evaluation. However, that evening afterwards, at my studio, he said, "Would you like to go to a party? I've been invited to a party." I said, "Sure, I'll go with you to a party." So he took me to a party, and at that party he took a little bit of brandy out of his pocket and started drinking his own brandy, which I thought was rather unusual. And he said, "Lukas, do you know that my teacher was Rimsky-Korsakov?" I said, "Yes, I do know." He said, "Well, in the lessons, Rimsky-Korsakov never let on that maybe I was special, but I knew he knew, and he went like this to me." And that little gesture with his elbow against my elbow, so to say, put me through the next 3 years, It meant a lot to me.
Yeah. Well, it's a nice combination of treating you like a colleague, that doesn't need a child's pat on the head, and
yes,
still letting
wonderful.
you know. That's a beautiful story.
Wonderful. And then later on in California, where he lived, when I became a teacher at UCLA, then we really became friends, and we had dinner together, and at his house, at my house, and it was wonderful. It was a real friendship then.
Lukas, let's talk a little more about your evolution as a composer. You've mentioned the early admiration for Hindemith and then Stravinsky and Copland being an important influence. You've had a very, it seems to me, you have a very restless creative spirit that kind of is always open to new ideas. Would you say this is something you think about, or?
Well, I compose because I love music. That means you love other people's music. Mm-hmm. And the more you get that, the more you make your own. The trick is not to imitate. Influences are in everybody's music. That's not interesting. What's interesting is what you do to the influence, what you make of the influence, how you make it your own. So making Copland, Stravinsky, and all these things your own is enriching to my vocabulary.
I remember a time when you were greatly involved in improvisation. Mm-hmm. I imagine this would have a profound effect on your composing. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little bit? Or?
Yes. What happened is that at UCLA, I wanted to free my students from the tyranny of the printed note, as I put it at that time, and change their lives that way. And little did I realize that with this experiment that was supposed to change my students, it would change me. But that's exactly what happened, because my early improvisations with my improvisation group at UCLA, my students, sounded, as Piatigorsky once put it so well, like music badly remembered. Familiar and badly remembered. So one day I asked myself, well, what would actually thrive on the improvisational process? What would make it fresh and interesting? And with that question, I opened up the whole Pandora's box of avant-garde music and aleatoric music at the time when aleatoric, the word that comes from the Greek word alias, which means dice, had not yet permeated our jargon. It was very early, 1950 or something like that, when that, what was it, 1960? I guess it was close to 1960 when that happened. And suddenly our improvisations changed. I began to ask my students and my friends to improvise in a different way, and we tried to discover things, and we suddenly we became chance music, became the thing. Before, I mean, even John Cage said that our improvisations had a certain influence on him also. It was very early in the game, but we really suddenly became aleatoric. Now that was a very unusual thing at that time, wasn't it?
Yes. And you then, didn't you move to Buffalo after that?
Yes.
And continue this
then I continued the improvisations in Buffalo. Then I brought my improvisation ensemble to Europe, and by that time we did very exciting improvisations that were not at all like music badly remembered. They were very different. In fact, the improvisations in between the time cycle songs were very adventurous.
It seems to me that it's a very important part of this is having the group that is used to working together. I remember Boulez used to say that when there's a score, a modern score, that asks for the players to improvise something, he says you find out what music they know. But if you have an ensemble that's like a jazz group, you know, where there's this interaction and you develop over time, that must have been very interesting.
Exactly. It became a very interesting experiment, but as you just pointed out, after a while one doesn't improvise anymore what one doesn't yet know. One improvises what one knows.
Already, yeah.
Like every jazz pianist or so, every jazz improviser plays the licks that they know. So as it became less adventurous, I gave up on it, and I left it sort of to my students and didn't do it anymore, and became and reserved adventure for the loneliness of my composition studio again.
Still keeping some of these elements alive, as in making
definitely.
collages and
Definitely. For a while I used to write pieces that had moments that were improvisatory and aleatoric. Then I even gave up on that too, because I found that it swallows up so much rehearsal time. For instance, Baroque Variations, number 3, the third Baroque Variation, the Bach one, the one I wrote first and which Bernstein premiered, I believe in Carnegie Hall. That one, it takes so much time. Bernstein spent 6 hours of rehearsals on trying to get the New York Philharmonic to do it just right. He would suddenly turn to the orchestra and say, "Did you hear the sounds you just made? Do you realize you're the first people who ever made that sound?" It was fascinating, but it took as much time as the entire Mahler Sixth Symphony. And the Sixth Symphony of Mahler is an hour's, more than an hour work. And my piece is 10 minutes. That variation number 3 is 10 minutes.
yeah.
So so just recently, Michael Tilson Thomas said to me, "Lucas, I would do Baroque Variation number 3 all the time if only you wrote it out, because I haven't got time to teach the orchestra how to improvise."
So how is it written, in fact? How would the score look to?
Well, the score looked with all kinds of words that explain what they were supposed to do, and it takes an enormous amount of rehearsal time. So I finally...
For example, what would be some of the words that you would use? What would be an instruction?
The instructions would choose from the Bach sheet and play the Bach notes, and don't play them audibly until called upon by the conductor, and then emerge from inaudibility into audibility. And it's very complex actually to do it right, to do the emerging and submerging right. So when Michael told me this, he said, "Please write it out." I did it actually, and since then I can do it. I have enough rehearsal time now to do it, and he does it in the new version. But of course it was very exciting in the other version, in the old one, and still occasionally is being done that way.
If the players themselves are that involved in actually creating their own part too.
Right.
Yeah. Would you feel that you have been through an evolution as a composer, or have you had moments of epiphany and decided to do this and reject what had come before, or?
Well, I did my style, I should say my technique changed all the time. We always get style and technique mixed up. I think they're two different things. It's the technique. Style is basically personality. But from neoclassic, via this improvisation experiment that was supposed to change my students, I became suddenly a wildly avant-garde composer. And then finally in my third period, if I can call it the third one, I don't know, I combined everything. I combined my early Americana suddenly with some very experimental stuff that I did in that second period. And that's what I do now. I do anything can happen any moment within one movement.
It's a very interesting point about separating style from technique. And it seems to me that a lot of people seem to think that a composer can create a personality out of techniques. And it seems to me that there's something much more profound about the style of a composer's voice. And it's hard to talk about it, but I think it's important for...
But it doesn't have so much to do with Carnegie Hall. That's the only trouble.
Well, it all has to do with Carnegie Hall, because Carnegie Hall, I mean, it's a wonderful building, and it's a beautiful stage, and all of that, but it exists for music.
Conducting the Ninth Symphony at Carnegie Hall was a real event, but that was with Buffalo, wasn't it?
When did you do that? We don't have all of your
Yeah, I
conducting.
conducted the Ninth Symphony in Carnegie Hall with Buffalo, but not with Milwaukee, if I'm not mistaken. It was only with Buffalo. Yeah.
Do you want to just sort of run through the years and give us a few highlights, moments you remember?
I'm not that good at that. That's the trouble. I shouldn't really talk about things that are not documented, but on the other hand, I know that for a fact that I did it because...
Oh, that I'm sure is documented. We just didn't pull up. You're just so involved with Carnegie Hall. We only pulled up the the composer files. And what was it like to do the Ninth Symphony here?
Oh, it was a fantastic experience, and it sounded so beautiful.
And do you remember which chorus you used, or?
I think it was the chorus of, what was her name? Oh, that's pitiful. No, it wasn't Margaret Hawkins. It was the other one, the one from Chicago.
Oh, Margaret Hillis.
Margaret Hillis.
Well, that's a very good group.
Yeah.
That must have been thrilling. I also find that no matter how many times you've been on this stage or in the hall, there's still something very special about being here.
Very special.
All these. Here's something you had actually inscribed to Carnegie Hall, with something from your cello concerto, and it was a concert in 1967.
Oh yes.
That Rozhdestvensky conducted.
Except for
London Symphony, but you conducted your piece.
I conducted my cello concert, and Slava Rostropovich was the wonderful cello soloist. Yes. I wrote it for him.
This must have been quite a concert. Vivaldi concerto, 2 Vivaldi concertos, the Lukas Foss cello concerto, Boris Tchaikovsky concerto, partita for cello, harpsichord, piano, electric guitar, and percussion, and the Shostakovich Concerto No. 1.
How could one cellist play all these pieces one after another? But he did.
And probably went out to a party afterward too. I think Rozhdestvensky was the conductor of the BBC about that time, wasn't he?
Could well be. I don't remember.
And we have an inscribed manuscript from the cello concerto.
Can you hold that a little? I don't know if it's never going to work. Let me see. Yeah, this way.
How's that? I'd take it out, but Gina would be mad. There. What an evening with that many cello concertos running from Vivaldi to Foss. It must have been...
Right.
The Shostakovich would have been written for him also.
I would imagine so, although I'm not sure, but I think so.
And you wrote yours for him?
Definitely. He said to me, I play 50 concertos. I want yours to be the most difficult. And I did it. I wrote such a difficult concerto that practically no one else can play it.
Why is it so difficult? Does it have musical difficulties as well as technical ones?
Technical and musical. I don't know how he could memorize it. I could never memorize that concerto, but he did. Yes,
he's an extraordinary musician.
I remember how he said to me, come and I'll play it for you. I said, well, certainly, why don't I give you a ring? I don't answer the phone when I'm memorizing your concerto. He said, I said, okay, so when shall we make it? He said, well, how about in 2 weeks from now? So we made a date. And he said, when I memorize your concerto, I'm locked into my apartment by myself and so forth. So when I came to his apartment, I rang the doorbell, and a beautiful young woman opened.
How do you feel about writing concertos?
Well, I've written so many. I love it.
And you like the idea of really presenting the soloist front and center.
Well, sure, and pleasing the soloist, doing something that is challenging and that works for the soloist. And I'm honored that many of my concertos were premiered, or played at least, at Carnegie Hall.
Yes, we have a few more here. We have the, of course, Carol Winson's did your Renaissance Concerto.
That's right, she did that in Carnegie Hall.
This is quite a bit later. This is not even bound yet. This is with the American Symphony under Bill Curry. This was the New York premiere of the Renaissance Concerto. And can you talk a little bit more about the piece? We were mentioning the fact that you, when you were quite young in France, studying the flute with a very famous flutist, an instrument that you later dropped and then picked up with this.
Well, I love the flute. I love the flute, and to what extent my early flute lessons had something to do with the success of that concerto, I don't know, but it had more performances in 6 years than almost any other work of mine. I think about 60 different organizations did it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I was very lucky with that work. Galway
Well,
plays it too.
He's a wonderful player.
Yes.
He also plays my flute concerto. There's something about the flute that seems to come out of the depths of the human somehow or other, that flute sound, and it's a very, very attractive instrument, I think. Did you do any improvisation with the flute when you were?
No, never. No, I wasn't much of an improviser until that improvisation project came along.
I was thinking more in preparation for the concerto. Did you
none.
haul out the flute again and
No,
see what
never.
it felt like?
No, I just wrote it.
Do you find you have a finger memory? For instance, I played the trumpet very
right.
seriously in high school and for a while in college, and then I haven't played it since. But I still have a finger memory for pitches with that instrument. It seems strange, but it doesn't seem to leave you.
Well, I have a finger memory for the instrument, but that didn't influence the composition.
It didn't.
The notes didn't come out of fingerings or that kind of memory.
But a feeling of connection to it, a feeling of closeness to the instrument, I don't know, intimacy with it.
True.
Here's a performance of a concerto for solo percussion and orchestra
Oh, that's right.
with Akiyama and the American Symphony.
Was John Williams the soloist? He's a wonderful percussionist. He lives in Buffalo, and he's absolutely the greatest. He's wonderful.
Akiyama is a very, very nice conductor. He's done my work. And of course, I spent 7 years in the American Symphony under Stokowski. And I remember when Akiyama came to guest conduct us for Brahms' second, I think.
But in this concerto, the conductor is probably a little disappointed because he's sort of upstaged by the soloist, because it's the soloist who walks around in the orchestra, and wherever he goes, things happen.
Oh.
It's quite improvisatory that way.
So this is from, when was this? Oh, 1972?
Yes, that was shortly after my improvisation period.
So you were still
Involved with
influenced
that.
by that. Did he have a setup somewhere on the percussionist on the stage, or did he carry instruments?
He carried
or
things,
did he
but
have...
they were also set up both. And at one point, he walks over to the timpani and engages in a kind of a battle, playing the timpani from the wrong place, from the
other
opposite side.
yeah.
And there's a kind of battle going on between the two timpanists, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And then there's a funny cadenza in which the percussionist hits more and more instruments. First of all, just 1 or 2 or 3, then 4, 5, 6. Finally, it's like a Charlie Chaplin film. He hits everything in sight. So,
Were you thinking in a sense of a choreography when you were doing this, as well as the musical development, that you're thinking of how it would look on stage?
Well, choreography is probably too grandiose a term, but certainly a happening. And those were the days when composers sometimes thought that way, thought theatrically. And it's true, that concerto is very theatrical from that point of view.
And the going around on the stage, not being anchored to one spot,
That's right.
was a very interesting thing around that time. This is 1976. Lukas, there's a work here called Waves that you told me that you had withdrawn. And
That Eleazar de Carvalho conducted
that's
in Carnegie
right,
Hall.
with the Pro Arte Symphony Orchestra. He did a Mozart 23rd Symphony, the Brahms First Piano Concerto. Incidentally, I saw in your apartment a wonderful picture of Brahms with your great aunt, and it intrigued me, and I just. I know you didn't bring it, and one of the reasons you didn't bring it is that you didn't want to establish a tie that wasn't there. But it's kind of, I think, interesting for people to think about the span of time and how, well, how really short this history is. This
And
was your
how small
great
the
aunt,
world is, right?
And how small the world is.
That's right, you're so right. However, I don't even know how my great-great-aunt met Brahms. I don't know anything about, but they're sort of close together in that picture.
Yes, they look very, very friendly.
Yes.
You said great-aunt or great-great-aunt?
Now,
Is it your grandfather's sister?
I
or-
think it's great-aunt. It's not
Yeah.
great-great-aunt. I think it's great-aunt. Yes.
So, for instance, are you a grandfather?
No,
But
not yet. I'm too young.
Oh yes, of course. But it's a much closer sort of time relationship than one thinks, especially since in music so many of us have had telling important experiences as very young people, and we've
That's
known
true.
people who were old. When I was a teenager, I knew Ernst von Dohnanyi very well, and I played in his conducting
wonderful.
class, and actually played chamber music with him. And of course, he knew Brahms, and it's sometimes I think people tend to lump the past in something way back there, but it's
I wished I had
interesting how
known
those
Brahms,
fabrics.
but I was too
yes.
young. I couldn't. But I understand that once at a party he insulted everybody, and then when he left he said, I hope that those I forgot to insult will forgive me.
That's lovely.
But speaking of family ties, my uncle, who was a famous doctor who invented the gastroscope,
Oh, really?
was in his spare time the conductor of the Doctors' Orchestra in Munich. And he actually orchestrated my early opera, of which I stopped after Act 1. I decided Act 1 was childish when I got to Act 2, and I dropped the whole project. But he orchestrated that, so he was very,
Must have been an extraordinarily interesting man.
very interesting man.
Your family, I think, must have been quite interesting. Your father was a philosopher, wasn't he?
Professor of philosophy at Haverford College, yes. Although he started out as a lawyer in Germany.
And wasn't allowed to practice at a certain point?
Well, you
or-
can't practice German law here. I mean, and you're
No,
not
but I mean,
allowed
in
to
Germany,
practice.
he practiced law in Germany, and then when you left,
That's right. He had to do something else, so he took up philosophy because philosophy was actually his first love. He was a student of, who was it again? Of a very famous philosopher, right now. And he wrote philosophy books while practicing law in Germany,
Oh, really?
and then wrote some more books in America. So yes, he was a very interesting man.
So the searching is a part of the genes there, I think.
Maybe
you
that's a
know.
good way of putting it.
Yes. We got stopped on Brahms here. After intermission, he did your piece called Waves, world premiere, and then the Schoenberg Chamber Symphony, the full orchestra version. That's an interesting.
Yes, interesting program. Not typical for Cavallo, but interesting.
I see the orchestra here. It looks like quite a lot of fine New York freelance musicians.
Yeah.
Matthew Ramone.
Yeah, I
was the
withdrew that
concertmaster.
piece. I didn't like the piece, so I withdrew it. That sometimes happens.
Yes.
More recently, I withdrew a piece called Embros. I don't know if that's ever been done in Carnegie Hall. It's possible.
We don't.
Embros, a piece for a few musicians of different choice. They can be different kinds, different performances. But I didn't like that one, so I withdrew that.
That's. I know that feeling.
And I later on used the theme of Embros for the theme of the last movement of my left-hand concerto that I wrote for Leon Fleischer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So it wasn't a total loss.
No, I like that theme.
I also think that, I mean, it seems to me that speaking of Brahms, that Brahms was one of the few composers that when he revised something, actually improved it. And I don't know if you've ever looked at the early B major piano trio compared to the later one. And the later one is so...
It's much better, huh?
Oh, it's much better. It has all the wonderful material in the first one.
I
but
don't know the early version.
It's just full of fugatos, and he sort of showed everything he knew how to do. And then he really sort of simplified and made it spontaneous.
I should hope that when a composer revises a piece, he makes it better and not worse.
That's a very difficult thing to do.
It's true. Well, Beethoven's Leonore III, I think, is better than Leonore II, but Robert Schumann preferred Leonore II.
Yeah.
So.
One thinks of Hindemith works, for instance, that would not, be improved by his later philosophy.
That's interesting.
It's, I don't know. Anyway, I can understand withdrawing rather than revising. Now we have, so far we haven't talked at all about chamber music, and you're, certainly well known as a chamber musician as well as a
well, that
composer.
piece, Embros, was a chamber piece, yes. I've written a lot of chamber music. You're absolutely right.
And one of the things we have, in fact, we have a photo that seems to be properly dated 1983. This is Lukas in 1983, and that was the year that the Da Capo chamber players did a concert of your.
What piece was that?
Music. I think they did a whole concert. I will have it right here. It says here. Here we go. No. This is just solo.
I believe
that's a different concert.
The last time I played chamber music in Carnegie Hall, I will always remember,
Here, 87.
because it was the first time
Hush.
that the hall had changed. That was the first time I got to play in the new hall, the new Carnegie Hall. So I remember that one. And that was my piece, Tashi.
Yeah, that's a little bit later. That's in 1987. Here's the program, 83. Yes, Da Capo chamber players did 2 early pieces for violin and piano, Early Song and Composer's Holiday, and 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, with Rosemary Franey.
Oh, yes.
Any relation to Mirella?
No, Rosemary Franey was a singer at City Opera Company.
And then at the end of the program, they did Time Cycle.
So it was all my music, huh?
Yes, there was a small piece by Aaron Copland and Louise Talma, and Leonard Bernstein wrote an anniversary for Lukas Foss, and the Stravinsky 3 pieces for clarinet.
All
but this was
friends.
obviously a tribute to you. In fact, it says it with a tribute by Aaron Copland. So I don't
How
know if
wonderful.
he spoke or. That was in '83, in this era. I didn't show this picture, which I think is a very, very nice picture of you from 1968. I think that's such a nice photograph. While Nick was changing his cassette, we were talking about Brahms a little bit more, and you had a story you wanted to...
Yes, what happened was when I was in my first year as conductor of the Buffalo Philharmonic, I was asked to do the Brahms Requiem, which I was happy to do, and I conducted it, and at rehearsal I decided, what a shame that Brahms goes from that fugue where everybody yells out their voices straight into that beautiful choral tune of the last movement. Why didn't he give a rest to the voice and have an interlude? So I thought, well, I could do an interlude with Brahms's notes. I just held myself to Brahms's notes from the beginning or from somewhere towards the beginning and orchestrated for distant violins like a dream, like a reminiscence. It would be very beautiful. And I did that, and that's the way I conducted it. And that night I get back to my hotel and I find a note in my box. The note said, "What you did to my Requiem made me turn around in my grave." So I turned to the hotel clerk and I said, "Tell me, who brought that note?" "I don't know. It was a little fat man with a beard." To this day, I do not know who brought that note. Was it Brahms?
That's a cute story. And I was telling you that I knew Arts von Dohnanyi very well in the last few years of his life, and played chamber music with him and played violin in his conducting class. And, he had some very interesting insights based on his actually knowing Brahms as a young man. For instance, how Brahms often starts a development section with the first subject,
yeah,
and then goes away. And apparently Brahms had told Dohnanyi that that was a kind of a nod to the tradition of repeating the exposition, which of course he no longer wanted to do. And just certain little things like that that sort
Wonderful.
of get filtered from one musician
That's a
to
very
another.
interesting statement.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that you were talking about the being a prisoner of the page. This is something I feel with performers all the time, that you want people to be liberated from the notes on the page and get to the essence of music. I can understand the Rostropovich story very well. I mean, to have the music internalized, so it's not something that one is reading, but it's something that one is emitting. And it seems to me that we have an odd combination of a written and an oral tradition, that so much depends on the example of a teacher and the performances that one hears, and how things get turned into a tradition. And it's a very hands-on kind of personal, one person to another experience, rather than something written in stone and handed down. It's a,
Yeah.
excuse me.
That's very well said.
We have a program from the Baroque Variations that's very interesting. This is you conducting the Buffalo Philharmonic in 1968. And you were doing Riek for large orchestra by Isan Yun.
Oh, yeah?
Calcium Light Night by Ives. The work I like a lot. That's
Yeah.
a nice piece.
Yeah, Ives was very important in my life. I mean, that was my last influence, maybe, the Ivesian influence.
And
When I
can you-
discovered him, I got very excited about the idea of a polyphony of musics, not just different parts, but different musics going on at once, that I thought was fascinating. But what I really loved about Ives was that he was two things that nobody else combined: innovative and childlike. You know, where else do you find that combination?
And there's a little bit of a bad boy in him too.
Exactly.
You know, it's
Yeah.
not a well-behaved child, but
No, like me.
little, yes, perhaps.
Exactly, naughty.
No, I didn't say you were naughty. You said
I
you were
am.
naughty.
Still am.
Anyway, after the Ives, you your Baroque variations. This is described as the first complete New York performance. And maybe, Nick, you can get this program because it specifies these are variations on. And the Bach, that's the.
That's right.
That's the movement.
The E major partita, yes.
That gave you the treble, the
That's
orchestra,
right.
the treble.
That's right. It's called phorion. Phorion is Greek for stolen goods. Because all the notes in it are derived from Bach. Even the glissandos go from let's say, the first note to the last note of a bar or something like that. Everything is derived from that. It's not a variation. It's really composing with.
A recomposition?
Yeah, it's like destructuring or whatever you want to call it, deconstructing.
I read somewhere where you had a dream or an image of
That's
like
right.
16th notes
Being
coming
washed
apart
ashore.
and washing up on a shore.
That was the vision, a dream vision that prompted the piece.
That's a very clear statement of that,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Then you, after intermission, you did Babbitt's Correspondences for Strings and Tape, world premiere, and Penderecki's Capriccio for violin and orchestra. So you did a concert of, well, it is even described as a gala festival concert of New York premieres, including a world premiere.
Yeah.
That's a wonderfully adventurous program. How long did you stay in Buffalo?
7 years.
This is from 68.
7 years as music director, but I still go back occasionally as guest conductor or conductor laureate, or whatever you want to call it. But I was 7 years music director.
I hear very good things about the orchestra. They did my. They were one of the co-commissioners of a trumpet concerto I wrote for Doc
Oh,
Severinsen.
good. They did your trumpet concerto.
Yeah, American concerto.
I still haven't heard that. I want to hear it somewhere. I bet you can write better for the trumpet than anybody.
Well, it's a very interesting thing to write for an instrument that you play somewhat. I mean,
Yeah.
as you say about improvisation, you don't want to be constrained by your technique.
Yeah.
It seems to me we're always trying to make a virtue out of what we know and what we don't know, and try to. I feel that way, that there's so much that one doesn't know, and to make that a plus rather than a deficit, and not to take what you know
Right.
about an instrument as a limitation, so that you can only write. I mean, I'd hate to write a.
So when do I get to hear your trumpet concerto?
Oh, I'll send you a tape.
Love that.
Here's the world premiere of your. No, I'm sorry, the New York premiere of your work called Taaffe, for Taaffe.
That's right. That's what I
Just
remember.
Richard Stoltzman, Ida Kavafian, Ted Arm, Steve Tenenbaum, Fred Sherry.
I remember different acoustics suddenly in Carnegie Hall, you know. At
Well,
least
this
from
is
from the stage.
the opening of this is the new
Yeah.
season.
Yeah. It was very interesting.
Yes, I think I had my piano concerto was done here just after the renovation. You weren't playing. I don't know why I had the idea.
I wasn't playing Taaffe.
Oh, you
I
were
wasn't-
playing. Okay.
Yeah, Taaffe I was playing, but maybe not the rest of the
No,
program.
no.
But Taaffe I played.
Okay, because it doesn't say.
They insisted I had to play my own piano part.
That's a nice group of people.
Wonderful. I
Really,
love them.
very
I love
flexible
them.
and interesting.
Yes.
Yeah,
I wrote it for them.
yeah. Do you want to? Did the title have any meaning to you other than their
No,
group?
Not to me, no. It was just the group.
Yeah. Okay, just curious. You and Stoltzman have collaborated quite a bit, I would say.
Ever since Taaffe, yes, we became real friends. And I turned my piece Taaffe into a concerto, into a clarinet concerto, which he premiered.
With whom? Do you
I
remember?
think Los Angeles and Los Angeles Philharmonic, and then he also did it elsewhere. He did it with me somewhere, I think Brooklyn. But we didn't do it in Carnegie, unfortunately.
Yet.
Not yet.
Yes.
He plays it beautifully.
Oh, I'll bet he does. He's a wonderful player.
Yeah.
Actually, I think we have a picture of you and some of the Taaffe people here somewhere.
Oh, that's
Don't
right.
we have the...
I brought it. I brought the picture. Oh, but that's Taaffe and Michael Tilson Thomas.
Here we go. Here's
Is that Stoltzman and Michael
yes,
Tilson Thomas?
Lucas and Richard Stoltzman and Michael Tilson Thomas.
So it's not the Taaffe group, no?
No, it's not. I thought we had one of Taaffe, but... Now, was this... was he playing your concerto perhaps with Tilson Thomas?
Is that when it was? It's very
I have
possible.
no idea. It looks fairly recent on all counts.
Maybe that's when it was. I'm not sure, but that could very well be.
It's a nice picture. Little. We have a Yaddo program. Yaddo and Curtis with your Capriccio for cello and...
Oh, that was a benefit for Curtis
Curtis
for my
and
school,
Yaddo,
yes.
Did you go to Yaddo?
Never.
Or
McDowell
McDowell?
Colony, yes.
Yes.
But Yaddo, not yet. Maybe I will. They want me to come. They're
Yes.
very sweet about that. They really want me to come.
I haven't been there either, but I've been to McDowell, and I found that lovely. Which studio did you have, do you remember?
I had different ones in different years, but the one I liked was the first one. What was it called? If you have a name for it, I can probably identify it.
How far was it from the dining room?
Far.
Far. Maybe it was the McDowell studio.
Yeah, that's the one it was.
With a big piano?
Yeah.
Big, terrible piano?
I think that was the one.
It was in the woods and had a nice little porch.
That's right.
Yeah. I had that one too.
Oh, those
That
were
was
such
very-
exciting days. I wrote a lot of music there.
Yeah. Do you remember when you were there, which years, or which pieces that we've talked about you worked on there?
I know the Prairie was already written, so
You must have written the Prairie when you were very
19
young.
is when I began at age 19.
19.
But I was at the McDowell Colony earlier than that, I think. I was at the McDowell Colony already age 17.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And you found out
Maybe
about
I wrote
this
part
through
of the Prairie there. Maybe I did write part of the Prairie there.
the circle of composers that you knew, Copeland.
Well, Joseph Mackless was there. He's not a composer, but he was there.
He was.
Yes, we became friends. In other words, when I was 17.
Yeah. That's
Louise
interesting.
Talma was there,
Yeah, Louise
and she was my dear friend. Yes.
always goes there.
Still is.
Yeah. It's interesting that there are these places that offer a kind of a hospitable environment for an artist, not just the time alone, but the interaction with the other
Yeah.
people who are there, the writers and the painters.
Yeah, it was
and,
fun to
I
have that.
enjoyed it very much too myself. Okay, did you say we have a very recent program? One that's not even on the list? Richard Stoltzman clarinet, Lukas Foss piano,
Yeah.
the American connection.
I don't do this kind of recital except with Stoltzman.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny that it's a shame that the recital has kind of lost its panache. I think it's
It's true.
it's a wonderful
And it was
wonderful
a
way to hear music.
And it was a fun program because it was all friends of mine.
Gershwin, three
Oh no,
preludes.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. That's totally untrue. Gershwin, I never met.
Copeland piano blues.
Copeland, I played and enjoyed
Yeah.
playing, of course. He was a great friend.
You could have known Gershwin. You just were in different
No,
circles.
he died the year I came to America. I couldn't have known him.
Okay.
And also we did Ives, and I never got to know Ives, so that statement was wrong.
Well, all composers you feel close to.
Otherwise, Steve
And it
Reich,
includes Steve Reich.
Steve Reich I know well. In fact, he took a few lessons from me in Ojai, California, way back.
Oh,
when I was
really?
music director of that festival.
Have you done much teaching in your
Oh yeah,
career?
quite a lot.
And do you like to do this, or is this something
It keeps me young. Yeah, it's nice to, you have to ask yourself questions all the time.
Yes,
when you're
yes.
teaching.
Yeah,
It's very nice. I enjoy it, still enjoy it.
Well, something keeps you young, so that's. And you also, there's this, the Hindemith, Kleines
right.
Rondo,
And
from the
Bernstein.
clarinet sonata, and Bernstein
And clarinet
sonata.
sonata.
That's a nice piece, the Bernstein clarinet and piano sonata. Didn't he write that at Tanglewood?
Well, I only know he wrote it when he was about, what, 22?
Yeah. I haven't heard it in many years, but I just sort of had the memory
Wasn't
of.
that his first published piece? I'm not sure.
I think it might have been. I don't see what the notes say, but that's a nice and a very, very early work. Well, we've basically covered the material we have here. I do want to add this. Have a postcard from
whom is it?
Rajensky, 1945.
From Rodzinski?
Yes, 1945.
Great.
From Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And this is this is about what he looked like at this time. I wonder, what the future archivist will do with the messages that get left on answering machines, as opposed to the little notes that people used to write one another. It's nice to have those. And
I'm so
today,
glad-
they would call and leave a message.
Exactly. Those days are over. Besides the days when we composers all wrote letters to each other, I mean, we were like a club, the Ivory Tower. We were like a club, and now each one for himself.
Do you think? I guess I'm interested in the ways in which you think the music world has changed, and you've already mentioned what you described as when you came to this country. It sounds like you were embraced by a circle of people who were open to a new person coming in, and where there was a kind of sense of I don't know, noblesse in a way. It's a sort of the conductors looking to see who the new people were, and the composers helping one another out. Do you think that's because this was around the time of... what do you think this is the reason for this?
It could have something to do with the media, that nowadays composers think that if they're not on television, they don't exist. And they hire publicity agents. I can't imagine Bartók or Stravinsky hiring a publicity agent, or Hindemith. Inconceivable.
Did you know
Because
Bartók?
it was just work. Yes, I knew Bartók too.
That's a very interesting mind. Did you ever play with him, or?
No, we never played together. We never made music together, but I knew him because when I went to see Fritz Reiner to play him my Symphony No. 1, to play that for him, he was no longer my teacher, but he's still my teacher. I bicycled out to Westport, Connecticut, and the door opened, and there was Bela Bartók with Reiner. I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought, great, I get to play my symphony, not only for Reiner, but for Bartók. So we had lunch, and I said, Mr. Bartók, why do you teach piano? Why don't you teach composition? And he said, because composition very private with me. So when you play your symphony for Mr. Reiner, I will walk in the garden.
Oh.
But then we took the train together back to New York and had a wonderful conversation. And then a few years later, there was the premiere under Kusevitsky of his Concerto for Orchestra. And since there was no piano part, I didn't have to be at the piano. I sat with Bartók and looked at the score. And when we got to the last bar, I said, but Mr. Bartók, it finishes in the wrong key. No, you're listening with major, minor ears. You've got to listen modally. I said, yes, but one is suspended. It doesn't seem to work. I was so arrogant. I made a statement like that to Bela Bartók. Can you imagine? Well, he said, listen again. But a year later, he published the new ending, which everybody does. The old ending is still as an annex in the original publisher's score.
That's very interesting.
I don't know if I had anything to do with it, but anyway, he did publish another ending, and that's the one we all know.
Very, very interesting. He's someone that I've always thought must have been just a wonderful man.
Oh, he was wonderful.
as well as a composer.
The last time I saw him, it was after he had a stroke, and it was the most scary picture because I remember Bartók with wonderful blue eyes, the most blue eyes imaginable. And after the stroke, they were white, as if he had sent his eyes to the laundry, and all the color had gone out. Bartók with white eyes, that's like a ghost. That was the last time I saw him.
Wow. Now, when he came to this country, people tried to help him, I know, and Reiner managed to get together that commission for the Concerto for Orchestra. Do you feel that, I mean, in the way with which American composers welcomed everyone from Europe, and they became our teachers and our teachers' teachers, and all of this just became a part of the mix. Do you think that, was there a competition between, say, the homegrown composers who were around at that time and the people who were coming in, like Bartók and Hindemith and Stravinsky and Schoenberg?
It's an interesting point. I don't think there was competition. Depends on the composers. There are some composers who are very competitive, and they may have felt that way. But I was never aware of that. I mean, sure, in Los Angeles there was Schoenberg and there was Stravinsky. Maybe they were competitive, but I wasn't aware of it.
Because you mentioned, you feel that today it's much more competitive.
Yeah,
you know,
today
each
it's
person
more.
for himself, and I just wondering, you know, it's what you would think has happened to the music world to make this change that you feel is there.
But you know, competitive maybe we always were, but we were at the same time friends. Friends can be competitive.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Now
absolutely.
we're competitive without being friends. That's the difference. It's a sort of like a wall has descended.
Is it perhaps that I mean, this world that we're talking about in the 40s and 50s, the New York Philharmonic was certainly a focus of a lot of music that was happening in this country. The Boston Symphony was a focus. That there were kind of magnet places, and people were drawn together, and I don't know, maybe like birds flocking or something,
Yeah.
and the feeling of camaraderie. I would say I have some composers that are very good friends, close friends.
Yeah.
But the world seems very different from the days I hear about in the 40s, let's
And
say.
are your friends really interested in your work or in their own work?
I would have to honestly say probably their own work.
Well, that's where the difference lies. In the old days, after a concert, we would all gather in the Russian tea room or wherever and talk about the music we just heard. Nowadays, colleagues just pat you on the board, said nice piece or very interesting, and that's it.
Yeah, very
There's no
interesting is
real-
sort of awful.
There's no real communication about it anymore. I can give you an example. When I discovered that pile of letters that I brought, you know, when I discovered that, and I saw that I had about 10 letters from Stockhausen and 10 from Boulez and from Xenakis and from everyone, I got very depressed because I'm not in touch with those people much anymore, now and then by chance. But no letters, no exchange. And I remember writing a letter to Xenakis and to Takemitsu. What happened? Why aren't we in touch anymore like we used to? And I got a nice one-sentence letter back from Xenakis. Dear Lucas, I love you. That was it. No response from Takemitsu, but strange enough, an invitation to conduct in Tokyo came by him. And so, I mean, there are two different responses to my question, what happened?
Yeah. Well, I suppose some of that is natural. I mean, when you're, you know, quite young and hanging out with people, and
Maybe that's it.
it's a
But
little
it was a
different as
club.
you get older. And
Didn't we wrote for each other in those
Yeah.
days? Now we don't write for each other. And there's something wrong with writing for each other because it's like a club, you know. We should write for everybody, shouldn't just write for each other. But we traded that mistake for maybe a worse mistake, which is not to have that communication at all. And to just write whatever is trendy, which is much worse.
yeah. Do you feel that, let's say, in the 40s and even further, there was a tremendous pressure to, a stylistic pressure, I should say technical rather than style. I like your definition of the difference between style and technique, but a pressure, particularly when Stravinsky began to write some 12-tone music. Was there a lot of, do you feel that a part of this being in a group was having allegiance to something, or was it just honest, open-minded appreciation of others' work? Or
I think it was appreciation of each other's work. At the same time, there was pressure. Certainly the 12-tone school exerted an enormous pressure. Somehow, Boulez felt that if you didn't write 12-tone music, you weren't with it. You were somewhere behind. Whether he still feels that way, I have no idea. But at that time, that was the general feeling. Milton Babbitt, I think, felt the same way.
That this was historical necessity, and
yeah, I never belonged to a school. I wrote 12-tone music when it was no longer necessary to write 12-tone music. I wrote aleatoric music before the word alias came into being. So I never belonged to any trend. And I think the danger of being trendy is, if you're trendy, you're really not with it in the right way. You're a bandwagon jumper, a follower, and that's not healthy.
What is it that Hindemith said about you? He wants to learn but not to follow?
That's right.
I would want that on my as my epitaph if I were you. That's
okay,
Paul
I'll put it on my tombstone.
That's a wonderful remark. On the other hand, it implies that there was a sense of pressure to have allegiance to something or other. I know I never felt this myself either, and I haven't quite figured out whether it was.
Do you teach?
Not really, no.
Not really, no.
No.
Well, there's some teachers that are like gurus. They expect the student to take their world and make it their own, which I can understand. But I must say I've never been too fond of the guru type. No. I'm the opposite type of teacher.
Sessions used to say that he thought that he wrote Sessions music better than anybody, and that he didn't want anybody to try. I thought that was a nice way of putting it.
That's
but
very good.
We live in a very interesting time. I mean, when you think of the changes that have taken place in your lifetime, the explosion of the media, and I mean, even in the, how did you come to this country? You came by boat, probably.
By boat.
That would have, Queen Mary?
Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth? What was it? Queen Mary, I think.
Probably Queen Mary. She's out in Long Beach, California now. I was still
boat.
A grande dame. The world must have been just so different in the days when, to come from Europe to the States, it took, what, 6 days, 7 days maybe?
Yeah.
As opposed to today when people fly all over the world. And conductors, I think, by necessity had to sort of stay in one place for a period of time. They weren't able to be in Amsterdam one night and New York the next and Tokyo.
Which is probably a good thing. I think conductors do too much traveling. First of all, they always travel with the same repertory and do the same repertory everywhere, and it becomes a recipe, it becomes formulaic, and I don't believe in that. I think Koussevitzky was right to stay put in Boston and make the most of his orchestra.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. They have not found a substitute for the really resident conductor. Also, when you think of even traveling back and forth to Europe, a sea voyage of about a week is certainly a wonderful time to learn some new scores or to look at some new things. Whereas today, I actually heard an administrator say of the conductor he works for that he shouldn't have to know new things and new performers, and that he's too busy and that it's his job as the manager to filter all of this through. Well, but that may work administratively, but it takes away the impulse of the conductor who hears someone else doing the young composer's piece, as in your Prairie, with Rogensky hearing the Shaw performance, and wanting to do it himself. And the notion of the connection of the conductor of the 90s to what's actually going on. It's a different, I think it's a different relationship.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any other things that have changed over the years? Do you think that the world is more or less composer friendly?
The world is success friendly. So if the composer is successful, they're friendly. That's not very idealistic, is it?
You mean on the world's part, or
Yeah, on the world's part.
No, it's not.
No, it's not great. But we survive, we composers.
Yes, I also feel this way, that sometimes we can be overwhelmed by the sort of contemporary notion that if it doesn't happen in Yankee Stadium, it doesn't happen. And that really the history of all of the arts are often the history of a small number of people in a tiny place. And that it doesn't have to be a mass sort of thing. I find that I have probably some of my most productive relationships are with performers, and we get to know one another over the years, and
Right.
there's a real, genuine music making going on there, and you know, it may or may not attract the most attention, but it seems to me that there are some very good avenues if we don't fall prey to the idea that everything has to be, you know, sort of like the mega hit and the mega success and the.
That's right. We have to understand that whether something is a success or not doesn't mean that it's good, and that the great composers were misfits very often. I mean, take Charles Ives, for instance, who had no success whatsoever during, except at the very end of his life when he was no longer composing, he became a legend.
Yes.
But here is a great businessman. He was a businessman during his day, who refused to take out a copyright on his music because, as he said, my music belongs to the American people, and they couldn't care less. I mean, to be a misfit like that is unthinkable today.
Well, but some people cared very much. I remember playing the Fourth Symphony. I was in the American Symphony the year after Stokowski did the premiere.
Well, that's when the legend began.
But we had parts that, I don't know, I mean, they were just in terrible shape. But somebody had very painstakingly put them together, and we were all, I mean, in the orchestra working on trying to figure out what is this and what is that, and trying to help.
Well, that's when that's when he became famous. Yes, but I mean to say, before he became famous, he didn't take out a copyright on his music. I think that's unusual, especially for a businessman.
Yes, it is.
It's very idealistic.
Or realistic. I don't know which.
Well, I know what you mean.
It's someone I know once was doing a concert of contemporary music in a small venue, and by mistake his home telephone number was put in the ad, and when he saw it he was very upset, but then nobody called, so then he was even more upset. Yeah. So one doesn't know whether he figured there wasn't well, at any rate, I think sometimes also when we look at history, it seems to me that we see it as we see the history of even our own lives. Well, of course, this led to this and this led to that, but at the moment it may have looked very bewildering and nobody knew what was going to happen next. And sometimes it seems like pieces have a history that's very different from their present. And that possibility is always there for a composer. I mean, I don't think that, do you think of posterity? Do you think of?
I never do. No, I think that would be grandiose. I don't like to think that way.
Yeah, I don't either. A lot of people do, though.
Yeah.
And I know you don't, because I have seen some of your archives, and if there's anybody who's worse than me, it's got to be you in terms of writing down when something happened, and you know, all of this, and keeping everything in order for the chroniclers.
Yeah, it's bad business, because archives are valuable. One should think it that way. But I always thought of music as work, not as a career. It's just work. As a composer, when you change your mind because you've had an idea. So that's a great moment when you change your mind. As a conductor, I've got to be a little careful, because when I change my mind and say, oh, let's not do it this way, let's do it the other way, they think this guy doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful. But actually, a change of mind is a very, very important element in your life, because you don't change your mind unless you had an idea. Yet, change of mind is often meant negatively. You know, people think it's a bad thing.
The notion that each composer has a particular vision, and we don't even have a way to talk about it. We don't even have words that correspond to the oral world. But I think it's to me, a very exciting trend, that it's not this sort of pluralism, like everything is like everything else and just as good, but the notion that you have all these different voices, and they have a different quality. They bring a different experience to music, and music means different things to strikingly different things to different
You're
people. But we were talking about the notated score being a relatively primitive instrument, and I was just saying that Stokowski used to, in rehearsal, hold up a score and say, "This is just black notes on white paper, and we have to, you know, give it life." And he took, of course, a great deal of freedom, even in, as you know, orchestrating things, not just he would reorchestrate Wagner, you know, and lean over and say, violas double the cellos and things like this.
Yeah, I wouldn't want performers to do that.
No, I wouldn't either, but it's remarkable that Stokowski's kind of freedom and his ideas have enjoyed a resurgence, which leads us to this whole topic of going in and out of favor, and the process of making a life as a composer or as an artist in our society. And I was just wondering what your experience has been in this regard. You certainly started off with an incredible bang, you know, at the top.
Well, I have very strong feelings, for instance, about trendiness, about things like performing things in the style of the, what is the word for it again? I can't think of the style of the time. What's it called?
The period practice, you know.
Yeah, the period practice.
There's a word
that's escaping me right now. Performance practice of the time, you know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I can't think of it.
Which I've discovered is a very dangerous
historically informed performance.
Yeah, that's very dangerous to, one should know those things. We should all know it, but we should not necessarily imitate the practice of the time, because practice of the time is really for mediocre music. To make something, let's say a Renaissance piece, to make it sound a little more interesting, add a lot of ornaments. You get a little spice. But when you have good food, you don't want a lot of spice. You want to do it right, and the way it is. So to add ornaments to Bach is totally wrong. So practice of the time is always based on, I think, on the mediocre, making it more effective.
Well, that's a very interesting observation, because so many of the rules of harmony, for instance, that come from that period don't really apply to Bach.
No.
And you can always make, I mean, I shouldn't say anything negative about a composer, but if you really want to see a perfect example of a 12-tone piece, you know, you look at a piece by Krennic that is you know, just sort of like a perfect example of a 12-tone piece. And it seems to me that there's, at any given time, there's a lot of mediocrity that, which is why it bothers me that people think of writing music to sort of exemplify a style. You know,
It bothers me too. I get very upset about that. That is complete nonsense. Imitating a style is not going to help any composer.
Do you feel, do you have a kind of picture of the music world since you've become aware of the ebbs and flows, the changes that have occurred, and what was considered important? And
what was considered important opposed to what is considered important?
yes, I mean the changes that have occurred over the years.
Right.
Do you think perhaps Ives was not just an outsider, but was at a time when the country was not quite sophisticated?
That's probably part of it. And besides, yes, he was just not, he was ahead of his time. To me, the unanswered question is interesting because that trumpet tune is to me like he's announcing the new era.
Yes.
It sounds to me like the beginning of modern music, is that in that trumpet figure, which is opposed to the background of harmonies.
Shimmering strings.
The major and minor chords that accompany it, and then suddenly you get this totally different thing held up against it. It's fascinating. That's the beginning that ushers in, I think, that ushers in our new music. But new music today is so many different things that I couldn't possibly even begin to define it.
Do you think it's necessary?
No, we don't have to define it. But take, for instance, minimal music. Now, minimal music, I remember conducting once a piece of minimal music, or the same program was a piece of Stravinsky, which I loved. And the minimal piece I liked because it made me feel good while I conducted it. But when it was over, I was as miserable as I was before, which is very much like the drug experience. You know, when you're on a drug, you feel good, then the drug wears off, you feel terrible. So, in other words, I thought, well, if that's what minimal music is about, that's wrong, because life is minimal in a sense. Every day is the same. We get up in the morning, we have breakfast and so forth, we have lunch, every day is the same, but slowly we get carried on towards death or transfiguration or whatever it is, and that one could write a piece of music that is minimal and at the same time slowly moves towards something else like life. Not like a drug, but like life. And that idea influenced certain pieces of mine.
It's a wonderful notion.
I think in other words, all these ideas, you know, you have to take them all with a grain of salt and rethink them and make them your own in a different way.
Would you hear minimalism in a historical context?
You can call Vivaldi the first minimal composer.
That's not what I had in mind, but that's an interesting thought.
I don't know what you meant.
Well, in the sense that a rejection of a certain world, a music worldview that was current when these people burst onto the scene. Although I have a little difficulty with the categories that people have. They talk about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and there was an awful lot going on in those times also. Maybe it didn't get noticed as much as, maybe one thing got noticed more than others, but it was also a very diverse era.
Exactly. All those categories don't work.
But if somebody were composing an antidote, you might say, or an answer to music they felt was overly complex or failed to make tonal centers or something, it seems to me that you could see that in a historical context, the minimalists kind of dropping the bombshell, you might say, into the scene.
Well, as long as you don't think of a technique as a style, because if you do, then, I mean, if you think I'm a minimalist composer or I am a 12-tone composer, it's as if Bach had said I'm a fugue composer and wouldn't write anything but fugues. That's impoverishing your style. I think we should really make that distinction and realize that these are just techniques. And the more techniques, the richer is our vocabulary.
I think most composers resent being put in any category. I know
Now they do,
always
yes.
complain about it.
Now they do, but there used to be a time when they say, I'm a 12-tone composer, very proudly.
When do you feel this was like in the 50s?
Yeah, in the 50s, that was the norm.
And do you want to talk about any of your colleagues or the things that were going on at that time?
I think we covered it. I don't have anything more to say about that issue that we haven't covered.
Do you think it's healthier that composers are not thinking of themselves as militantly 12-tone or militantly tonal?
Well, yes, because if they do, they're impoverishing themselves. Now, maybe if you're a primitive, you can make do with one technique. Maybe if Nancaro only wants to play a piano music, that's fine for a primitive. But if you are like Stravinsky, who is constantly curious about everything and incorporates it all.
I see your arm muscles too. Those are really
Terrific.
Stravinsky's a very, very interesting model, isn't he? And a peculiarly 20th century model of this restlessness and the...
Yes.
Do you have a favorite period of Stravinsky, or do you...
Well, I would say this period of Story of a Soldier and Symphonie des Avants, in other words, when he left Rimsky-Korsakov and Debussy behind and became real pure Stravinsky, but not yet completely neoclassic.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I like that period particularly.
It's interesting that you said when he left Rimsky and Debussy behind, because I always felt that the early ballets, rather than being something brand new, were just very much
Absolutely.
a part of that whole tradition.
That's right, they were. And very Russian and very...
And French.
Yeah, and French. Yeah.
And,
right. And beautiful. I'm all for it. But at the same time, when he became real pure Stravinsky, was even more exciting, I think.
It's
Sorry, I'm just having some kind of funny light. Okay.
and I think you would hold him up as an example of someone who, whatever he got into, whatever trouble he got into in his curiousness, he always made it his.
Always. Well, that's the whole idea. That's why critics very often love to point out influences. But the influences, anybody knows, are in everybody. It's what you do to the influence. That's the important thing.
Yeah. Do you think about critics and music criticism and what they say about you?
Well, for a while one does, naturally, after reading a review and so forth, one does think of it. But you get, I can take it as a composer. I can take criticism better than as a performer, because as a composer, the piece exists and will speak eventually for itself. As a performer, whatever the critic said happened, that's what happened.
That's a very interesting point.
Because it's gone. The performance is gone. So, I mean, the people will read the paper and say, I was at that concert, I thought it was pretty good, but obviously I was wrong, something like that. Because the printed word is the gospel. That's what it is. So there's enormous power there.
I was struck, someone gave me a book they were writing on Stokowski's wife. They gave me the galleys of it, and I was out somewhere at a performance. And I was reading some of it on the airplane, and I was stunned at the reviews that, this was Olga Samarov, the reviews in the 20s in New York, they used musical terms, they assumed familiarity with other pieces in the literature, and it was quite a different...
Olga Samarov was Kusevitsky's wife and niece and wife. Olga Samarov?
Didn't she marry Stokowski?
No, she married Kusevitsky.
Well, who am I thinking of?
Oh, you probably are thinking of Olga Samarov, but she married Kusevitsky.
Well, I think Olga Samarov also married Stokowski.
But that must be another Olga
Must be
Samorov.
it. But at any rate, she was a young pianist and went to Europe to make a reputation. But it was interesting to read these reviews. Do you think there was like a heyday of American musical criticism, like when Virgil was writing? And
No, I think that actually it's probably better now. I can't judge that. But it's a very tricky profession, the profession of a critic. I mean, to pass off your momentary opinion as something that's going to last, it's not easy.
yeah.
I like reviews sometimes that are absolutely outrageous.
How do you mean?
I enjoy those.
I mean, outrageous in
Well,
what
let's
way?
say
They
when
take it-
Winthrop Sargent of the New Yorker wrote about my Baroque variation, that what I had done to Baroque variation number 3, the Bach one, is pretty much what Duchamp did when he painted a moustache in the Mona Lisa. And subsequently, Duchamp gave up art for chess, and if Mr. Foss would do likewise, the whole cause of music would benefit. I thought that was great. I can just give up music and benefit the cause of music. In fact, I made, when the new recording came out, I made them put that review on the record jack. And the people said, they laughed. I thought I was joking. I said, no, I'm not joking. I love that review. Please print it on the record jack. I think it's very funny.
Well, it is, and also when you think about it, I mean, most people have to work very hard to benefit
Exactly.
the art of music. You would only have to stop. Yes, I also feel it's better to get a slap in the face than one of these. It was interesting.
Yeah, in
sort of
between polite
reviews or
kind of
comments.
shrug off, yes.
Do you do much of the audience discussion today, the meet the composer sort of format?
I do talk quite a bit about music, but I've got to watch out. As Isaac Stern once told me, that there were two ladies. One said, I heard Isaac Stern last night. Oh, really? What did he say? So I better be careful not to talk too much.
Do you find that, would you say that audiences have changed over your career? I mean, you've certainly been in all the venues and with...
I don't think so. I think they want to be entertained. They want to learn things. Some, at least the intelligent ones, want to learn things. And they're in for an experience. They hope there'll be a real experience. I don't think there's much change in an audience.
What kind of reaction did you have with, this kind of wonderfully interesting programming that you did in Buffalo and in Milwaukee?
Well, Buffalo became a sort of a divided city. Half of it were violently against me, and half was completely for me, fanatically for me. It was kind of fun. I love to return to Buffalo because it's as if I was still around. I mean, the issues are still there, and it was a lot of fun, actually. But then, as I became conductor of the Milwaukee Symphony, I was a little more careful. I wouldn't force modern music on them. I would kind of introduce it in the right way and put it together with the right pieces and be a little more politically correct about it.
How do you mean politically correct?
Well, in other words, make sure that I wouldn't mix things that don't go together at all, so that an audience that wants to hear something very adventurous and novel would not be disappointed by the rest of the program, and an audience that wants to hear Beethoven and Mozart would not be disappointed by the rest of the program.
That's quite a task.
Programming can be quite a difficult assignment, but an interesting assignment.
I imagine you've learned quite a bit as having to make programs.
Yes, I find program making very interesting and very difficult. For instance, what do you put together with the Ninth Symphony? You've got to find the right pieces to go together. If you put the First Symphony, many conductors have done that, First and Ninth, because it sounds interesting. But actually, after 10 bars of the Ninth Symphony, the First Symphony is like wiped out.
Yeah.
It just isn't there anymore, because the Ninth Symphony is so much stronger. I think it's better to juxtapose the Ninth Symphony with the Wellington's Victory of Beethoven, from the ridiculous to the sublime.
That's
because actually the Ninth Symphony has a few ridiculous moments in it too.
Well, I would say earthy, peasant-like
yeah,
moments.
That's right. So there, it makes a more interesting coupling.
When you did the Ninth Symphony here, did you do it with Wellington's Victory?
I forgot because I did it differently in different places. I don't remember which I did which. I sometimes played it together with Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw.
Ooh, that's an interesting combination.
There are all kinds of things you can put together that make for an interesting combination.
Where were we? Do you remember?
In New York.
Yes.
On 57th Street.
How do you get to Carnegie Hall?
You practice. Yeah, it's a favorite of mine.
What are you working on now, Lukas?
I am starting on an orchestra piece for Buffalo that was commissioned, and I finished an organ piece for American Guild of Organists.
Oh.
That will be done this summer here, but not at Carnegie. Some churches.
There's
I don't
no
know.
organ.
Yeah.
Have you written much for organ?
Well, not much, but a little bit. I've written one organ piece before, and I've written, the organ is part of sometimes a bigger complement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the orchestra piece for Buffalo, do you have?
I don't know what.
Do you talk about work in progress, or do you prefer to?
I have nothing to say. I'm constipated.
Yeah. If you were not feeling constipated, you would like to talk about a work in progress? Because that's
One
another way
one
where
shouldn't
we're also
talk about
different.
embryos, right?
Yeah, I always feel like the energy goes out of the work if you're
Yeah,
talking
it's better
about
to
it. You know.
keep it for oneself.
And besides, one doesn't always know what one's doing,
Exactly.
and nor should you really, I think.
Yeah.
Do you start with a kind of a general plan, or?
Not necessarily. Every work is, I start from scratch with every work. It's as if I've never composed before. It's weird. I have no recipe. And I compose, what is the saying? With the knowledge of the impossibility and the faith in the possibility.
It's a very nice saying.
Yeah.
Still, it gets written. It's kind of amazing.
And I find that when I conduct, for instance, and things go well, I feel like going back to compose. And after a great Ninth Symphony, you know, I can do anything composing. Right? Vice versa, when composing goes well, I haven't got any stage fright at all. I can do the concert in my sleep, even if I have to play the piano. I'm not worried. But if composing goes badly, then I'm really in bad shape for anything else, and vice versa. If conducting goes badly, it puts me back composing. So one influences the other.
That's interesting. It's well, it's coming out of your whole person.
Yeah.
It's very. You want to talk a little bit about your relationship with Bernstein, because that's a very interesting American musical story.
Well, as I said, I met him at Curtis Institute, and we became good friends for the next 50 years. We were friends and never really had an argument. He's the one friend I think I had. Maybe it's because we're so different in every respect, so different that we never argued.
That's.
You know, he came to music via jazz and all that, and I came to music via Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. And he had a totally different background, different kind of parents from mine.
And sort of a Russian ancestry.
Yeah.
isn't it? And
Yeah.
yours is German.
Yeah.
Your long-standing relationship with Leonard Bernstein.
That's right.
And I suppose one could notice the differences, but also the great similarities. I mean, the triple threat boys, you know, the
Yeah.
composer, conductor, pianist.
No, I was wondering why I never felt, for instance, any envy of his incredible fame. So it's because we're so different. And I think, I mean, he would say such generous things to me, to reporters and so forth, calling me a genius and things like that. I think we just think of each other as being totally different.
And you conducted his music, and he conducted yours. And
That's right.
You played his, and it's a.
But it was never an exchange deal. It never. It just happened completely naturally. He was like an older brother. He enjoyed it when I was successful, and I enjoyed it whenever I heard a great performance. I mean, I would clap like crazy, and it was wonderful. There was just never any notion of rivalry. And that's most unusual.
It certainly is. And it's a wonderful relationship. I mean, did you talk about music that you were writing
always.
a great deal? Did you show each other your pieces?
Exactly.
And
We
things?
played each other our new work, tried it out on each other, criticized, sometimes quite severely. And there was never
real
an argument.
Family. That's
Yeah,
very-
family. He was like an older brother. I remember in the very first days when I was still a young boy from Paris, he would, for instance, explain jokes to me, and I mean, he gave me an education in a sense.
I'm sure he, even as a very young person, knew all the jokes too, right?
Yes, he knew all the jokes. I didn't.
Lukas, is there anything left you'd like to cover? Any topics that you find of interest? Or
It'll
people?
come to me after we say goodbye, I'm sure.
Oh,
but
well, of
now
course,
I can't
but,
think of anything that I should cover that would be important to the archives.
I'm sure there were some evenings in the Russian tea room with this.
Oh yes, Here's
Gang
another
of,
one. Here's another one. What was the name of that dancer? Nureyev, yes. Stravinsky and I were having something at the Russian tea room, and who walks in but Nureyev, of all people? And he didn't want to interrupt our conversation, but he said hello to both of us very nicely, and spoke to Stravinsky for a while, and then he bowed out. And I said, my goodness, isn't he charismatic? And Stravinsky said, charismatic, yes. A little stupid, but a little stupidity goes a long way. It's a nasty story. I shouldn't have told that one. That was actually a joke on charisma. He felt that.
Yeah.
He himself, Stravinsky, walked on stage as if he were going to the bathroom in a hurry.
Yeah.
He had that wonderful, quick stride. Nothing charismatic, just energy.
Get it done.
But not charismatic. He didn't walk like Karajan. Here I come, the great man of music. Not a bit. It's just like going to the bathroom. Now that
Well, Reiner, I guess, was like that.
Reiner conducted, yes, sometimes, as if he would just sort of half asleep. Yes, it's true. Yeah.
There was a story, I don't know whether it was true, that a double bass player set up a telescope in Pittsburgh.
Oh yeah, I know that story.
Because his beat was too small.
That's a wonderful story. Yeah.
I don't know if it's true. It's one of those stories where if it isn't true, it's good anyway. It's a good story.
I know.
Lukas, thank you so much for sharing so much of your musical
it's been
history and your
wonderful.
ideas with us today.
It's been great. It's been great. I hope you have most of it on your camera. Otherwise, whatever happened is whatever, like the traffic. There's certain things you can't do anything about. They just happen.